Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Vietnam, one of the most hated wars ever fought. Unfortunately, for the third time in the 20th century, fathers had to watch their sons get drafted into another war for the U.S. Army. A war we had no part in describes Vietnam. The United States troops went off to war as a part of Truman Doctrine with its policy of containment, and one day on the Tonkin Gulf, allegedly a North Vietnamese ship fired on an American battleship, which in order caused Lyndon B. Johnson to have the Tonkin Gulf Resolutions formed. The Tonkin Gulf Resolutions allowed a blank check to be written by Congress in order for the president to use and subject military into Vietnam. The Tet Offensive marked the final downturn of the Vietnam War, in which the Viet Cong ran down into South Vietnam, attacking most major cities, including Saigon. The Tet Offensive marked that the U.S. needed to use their full military in order to defeat the communists, and that's something that was not going to be allowed by the U.S. citizens. During the occupation of Vietnam, over 58,148 men died for the cause of the United States containing communism, not to mention the unknown soldiers that died. The reason for many deaths of U.S. troops is because of the warfare used by the Viet Cong. Guerrilla warfare was extremely effective on our U.S. troops. The troops went through many forests unknown to them, rice fields, and insect-infested swamps. American soldiers could have been walking through a town, watching farmers tend their fields and citizens run and play. And as soon as the troops passed through the town, they would be turned around and fired on. Events such as this caused things like the My Lai massacre, where U.S. troops were paranoid because of these attacks and killed many Vietnamese civilians. While our troops were away fighting, support for their cause was lost. The new power of television showed all the things going on in Vietnam, and news of the My Lai massacre made American citizens outraged. All people saw back home was the killing of these civilians by many U.S. troops. This started many anti-war groups. Groups formed such as the Students for Democratic Society and held many protests throughout the course of the war, including the Kent State protest, in which 4 students were killed by the National Guard. During 1968 campaign for presidency, these groups supported Eugene McCarthy, and his response to these wild college students was his slogan, "Be clean for Gene." President Nixon thought it would be a good endgame tactic if the U.S. was to bomb Cambodia in order to cut off North Vietnamese supplies, but this action was very unsuccessful and outraged the American people.
First gaining momentum in the mid-1950s, the civilian rights movement of the 1960s is a large part of American history. Although all activists aimed at making life better for the various minorities, mainly African Americans, the various leaders came up with different ways to achieve this. One of the most well-known leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., implemented the use of peaceful protests to get more rights for African Americans. When they would protest, the African Americans would often get beat by cops, hosed by firefighters, and attacked by dogs. This was very important because when politicians and Northern Americans saw peaceful protesters being attacked, they sided with these peaceful protesters. Peaceful protest brought a lot of support to the civil rights movement. Another civil rights leader was Malcolm X. Unlike MLK, he supported the separation of African Americans and whites. He proposed separate counties for whites and African Americans. Also unlike MLK, Malcolm X did not believe in peaceful protest. He said that African Americans should use any means necessary to defend themselves from the racist whites of the South. Another major difference between the two was that MLK's ways gained support in the North, while Malcolm X's style lost support from politicians and Northerners. Another leader of the civil rights movement was Stokely Carmichael. This man was the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Inspired by the Greensboro sit-ins, This group of students began direct protest against segregation in the South. The most common form of protest that the SNCC used were sit-ins at local, racially segregated lunch counters. Lastly, we will talk about the March on Washington, probably the biggest moment in the civil rights movement. This event is most well known for MLK's extremely inspiring "I Have a Dream" speech. It is estimated that somewhere around 300,000 participants marched on Washington on August 22, 1963. Another interesting fact was that only 75 to 80% of the marchers were African American. The rest were either whites or non-black minorities. There were many sponsors of this event, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., the NAACP, and the National Urban League, led by Whitney Young. Although it had a ton of support, one man that condemned the march was Malcolm X, calling it the farce on Washington. All of this continued effort and work eventually led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
October 15th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane was doing a routine fly over the island of Cuba. After looking at the photographs taken a bit closer, experts knew that the pictures included missiles. Early the next day, President John F. Kennedy was informed of the missiles and started to put together a team to take on the crisis. His two right-hand men were Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and his brother, a.k.a. Bobby Kennedy. They know that they had to get the missiles out of there, but they also knew that they couldn't upset the Soviets and start a nuclear World War III. Now people always ask, why the island of Cuba? Well, ever since dictator Fidel Castro assumed power of Cuba on January 1st, 1960, there has been many assassination attempts against him, including the infamous mission called the Bay of Pigs. Ever since then, Castro said an attack on Cuba by the Americans is an equivalent act of war. When the Soviets heard this, they knew that this was a perfect place to place their MRBMs and catch us by surprise. So knowing this, President John F. Kennedy knows that no more missiles can come into the island of Cuba. So his first base of action was a naval quarantine of the island of Cuba. There were always thoughts of bombing the missile areas, but on October 21st, 1962, General Maxwell Taylor told JFK that an airstrike would not completely destroy all the missiles, concluding that American people could get hurt if an airstrike is called. So Kennedy stays with just the naval quarantine. The next day, President JFK addresses the nation about the crisis and sends the military to go to DEFCON 3. Even though the quarantine works pretty well, after many ships refused to stop or slow down, the military went to DEFCON 2, the highest in U.S. history. President JFK, knowing that war was not the way to go, started to talk about a compromise, or even a trade. So he sends Bobby Kennedy to talk to a Soviet ambassador, Dobrynin. Then they were thrown a curveball when two letters were sent to them by Khrushchev. The first one was very soft and even a bit whiny, while the second one was a really radical letter basically saying they were ready for war. With these two letters in hand, President Kennedy sends a compromise option of us taking our missiles out of Turkey and them taking their missiles out of Cuba. Khrushchev replies and agrees to the terms on October 27, 1962, and then on October 28th he announces that he agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba. If it wasn't for the great minds like Kennedy and McNamara, we might not be here today.
Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon.
On October 4th, 1957, the Union of Soviet Socialistic Republics launched Sputnik 1, the first satellite in space. The 184-pound, 22.5-inch sphere orbited the Earth once every 96 minutes. This marked a major turning point in the Cold War. This began what we call the space race. Two nations, the U.S. and the Soviets, duking it out for space supremacy, and with the Soviets launching their satellite first, the U.S. had to react or they would lose the Cold War, and most importantly, communism would win. Another huge victory for the Soviets came when they launched Sputnik 2 on November 3rd, 1957. In the Sputnik 2 was a dog named Lakia, marking the first living being in space. Another serious blow in in the U.S. space race was when the U.S. first tried to launch a naval Vanguard missile in space. But shortly after liftoff, it fell back to the ground. This made the U.S. look like a joke and made the Soviets look even more dominant in the space race. Things didn't really heat up until the 1960s. The Soviets were in the lead of the space race during this time, and they continued in the early 1960s, where the Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin into space, becoming the first man in space. But the U.S. was catching up because 1 month later, they launched Alan B. Shepard into space in 1961, making him the first American in space. After the U.S. began to get serious about space supremacy, they launched NASA, and in 1963, NASA announced the Gemini program, which was a program to construct new rocket ships capable of landing on the moon. Another victory for the U.S. came in 1964, when Ranger 7 transmits the first close-range images of the moon. The Soviets topped that because in 1965, Alexei Leonov spends 12 minutes outside of his Volkhod spacecraft performing the first spacewalks. But things look bad for the U.S. when in 1966 the Soviets launched the Luna 9 spacecraft, and it lands on the moon, and in the same year they launched Luna 10, which orbits the moon. But the U.S. does not give up, because in that same year they launched Surveyor 1, which also lands on the moon, and they launched Lunar 1, which is the first satellite to take pictures of Earth. But in 1967, both sides take casualty when Apollo 1 catches fire, killing everyone inside, and when cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov dies due to his parachute malfunctioning. Finally, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon, marking the first man on the moon and ending the space race.